What if I told you that one seemingly ordinary delivery turned into a life-or-death situation that changed an entire community forever? It all started on a quiet morning in the small town of Maplewood. Michael Torres, a diligent delivery driver for PrimeExpress, never expected that his usual route would lead him into a mystery so chilling that it would stay with him for the rest of his life. As Michael pulled into the driveway of a familiar house, something felt off. The house belonged to Margaret Bellamy, a sweet elderly woman who is known for her perfectly tended garden and friendly greetings. But today, things were different. The neatly trimmed hedges were overgrown, wilted flowers drooped under the summer heat, and piles of unopened packages sat abandoned on the porch. Michael's instincts kicked in when he noticed the windows of the house were dark, even though it was nearly noon. But what truly froze him in place was a faint, irregular flicker of light coming from inside the house, a stuttering glow like a failing bulb or an electrical spark. "Mrs. Bellamy?" Michael called out, his voice echoing in the eerily silent street. He rang the doorbell and knocked, but there was no answer. His heart began to race. Something wasn't right. Peeking through the window, he caught a glimpse of a chaotic scene. Furniture toppled over, scattered papers, and, most alarmingly, a faint haze that hinted at smoke. Michael's mind was spinning. Should he call someone? Was he overreacting? But then, as he stepped back from the door, the faintest whiff of something acrid, a mix of burnt plastic and smoke, hit his nose. That was the final push he needed. Without another second of hesitation, Michael dialed 911, explaining the situation as best he could, while the dispatcher assured him that help was on the way. Moments later, neighbors began to gather, curious about the commotion. Mr. Lewis, the elderly man from next door, approached Michael. "I haven't seen Margaret for days," he said, his face etched with concern. "She usually tends to her garden every morning. This isn't like her at all." The sound of sirens broke the tension, and within minutes, firefighters, paramedics, and police officers arrived. Michael stood frozen as they broke down the front door. What lay beyond it would reveal a horrifying truth and set in motion a series of events that no one in Maplewood would ever forget. Before we dive into the shocking details of what happened inside that house and how it changed not only one life but an entire community, don't forget to hit the like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring and thought-provoking stories like this one. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our incredible viewers around the world. Stay tuned, because this story is just getting started, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. As the firefighters pushed through the front door of Margaret Bellamy's home, Michael Torres felt his breath catch. From his vantage point on the porch, he could see plumes of gray smoke curling through the dimly lit interior. The once cozy home, which Michael remembered being filled with trinkets and cheerful decor, now looked like a place frozen in chaos. Inside, the scene was even more unsettling. The acrid smell of burnt plastic hung in the air, and the faint flickering light Michael had seen earlier was revealed to be a faulty electrical outlet near the kitchen, sparking intermittently against the charred remains of a nearby cabinet. It was a disaster waiting to happen, a moment away from engulfing the entire house in flames. "Found her!" a firefighter called out, his voice cutting through the haze. Michael's heart pounded as he strained to see. Two paramedics hurried past him, wheeling a stretcher into the house. Moments later, they emerged, carrying Margaret's frail figure. Margaret looked barely recognizable. Her usually well-kept silver hair was matted, her face pale and gaunt, and her body limp like a rag doll. An oxygen mask covered her nose and mouth as paramedics worked quickly to stabilize her. Michael couldn't tear his eyes away. He'd seen her just a few weeks ago, smiling and waving as she watered her hydrangeas. Now she looked like a shadow of herself, a woman who had been trapped in her own home and left to fend for herself. As the paramedics loaded her into the ambulance, Michael found himself walking closer. He didn't know what he wanted to say, but he felt compelled to do something. Anything. "Will she be okay?" he asked one of the firefighters, his voice trembling. "She's breathing, but she's weak," the firefighter replied. "It's a good thing you called when you did. A few more hours and this could have ended much worse." Michael nodded, but the words didn't feel like enough. He stood there on the sidewalk, watching as the ambulance disappeared down the street, sirens wailing, taking Margaret to the care she desperately needed. Once the immediate danger was under control, Michael found himself stepping hesitantly into Margaret's home. The firefighters had cleared the scene, but the remnants of the near tragedy were everywhere. A layer of dust coated the furniture, cobwebs hung in the corners, and unopened mail was scattered across the dining table. What struck Michael the most was the stark loneliness that seemed to permeate every corner of the house. Family photos hung on the walls, their frames slightly askew. A wedding photo caught his eye, Margaret as a radiant young bride standing beside a man in a military uniform. Another photo showed her holding a small child, but where were they now? Why was she living alone, struggling in silence? In the kitchen, Michael noticed a calendar pinned to the wall. The days were meticulously marked off with red X's, but the last one stopped 2 weeks ago. It was as if time itself had paused for Margaret on that day. As Michael carefully made his way through the house, he stumbled upon a small, dusty box tucked under the coffee table. Inside were old letters, each neatly tied with a faded blue ribbon. The handwriting was shaky but elegant, and they were addressed to someone named Harold. Curiosity got the better of him, and he unfolded the top letter. It was dated over 30 years ago, and the words immediately tugged at his heart. "My dearest Harold, today was one of those quiet days where I thought of you more than usual. The garden is blooming beautifully, but it doesn't feel the same without you here to see it. I miss your laughter, your stories, and the way you always manage to make even the dullest days bright. I hope you know that even though you're gone, you're still my everything." Michael swallowed hard, feeling an unexpected lump in his throat. Margaret wasn't just an elderly woman living alone. She was someone who had loved deeply and lost profoundly. Later that evening, Michael visited the hospital to check on Margaret. As he entered her room, he was struck by how small and fragile she looked, surrounded by wires and machines. Her eyes fluttered open as he approached, and for a moment there was a flicker of recognition. "Michael?" she rasped, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's me," he said gently. "I just wanted to see how you were doing." Margaret's lips trembled into the faintest of smiles. You saved me." Michael shook his head. "I just made a call, Mrs. Bellamy. You've been through so much. Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said, her voice growing steadier. "Not everyone would have noticed. Not everyone would have cared." Her words hit Michael like a tidal wave. In her gratitude, he saw something deeper. The weight of her loneliness, her struggle, and her unspoken hope that someone, anyone, would see her. As Michael left the hospital that night, he couldn't shake the image of Margaret lying in that house, alone and helpless. It wasn't just about saving her life. It was about giving her a reason to keep living. That night, he resolved to do more. Margaret's story wasn't over, and if there was one thing Michael believed, it was that everyone deserved a second chance, especially someone as resilient as her. The next morning, Michael Torres woke up with a new sense of purpose. Margaret Bellamy's frail figure and her haunting words, "Not everyone would have noticed, not everyone would have cared," echoed in his mind. He couldn't forget the loneliness etched in her eyes or the eerie silence that had enveloped her home. Michael wasn't the kind of person to walk away from someone in need, especially someone like Margaret, who had quietly endured so much. He decided he wouldn't just stop at saving her life. He was going to make sure she had a life worth living. Michael knew he couldn't do this alone. That afternoon, he took to social media, writing a heartfelt post about what had happened to Margaret. "Yesterday, I met someone who reminded me of how important it is to care for the people around us. Mrs. Margaret Bellamy is an 82-year-old widow who has spent years quietly tending her garden and bringing joy to her neighbors. But life hasn't been kind to her recently, and yesterday she nearly lost everything. She's in the hospital now, but her home is in desperate need of repairs, and she's been living in isolation for far too long. I believe we can do better for people like her. If you'd like to help, let's come together and show her she's not alone." The post gained traction almost immediately. Neighbors from Maplewood began sharing stories of how Margaret had impacted their lives. Parents recalled her tutoring their children after school. Elderly residents spoke of her kindness, always offering to help with errands or sharing plants from her garden. Even people who didn't know her personally were moved by Michael's story. Within days, volunteers showed up at Margaret's house, armed with tools, paint, and determination. The first step was addressing the lingering dangers. Electricians replaced the faulty wiring, while carpenters repaired the kitchen that had nearly gone up in flames. But the project quickly evolved into something more than just fixing a house. It became about restoring a life. A group of neighbors replanted her garden, filling it with vibrant hydrangeas, daisies, and lavender. Children painted cheerful murals on her garden shed, while others scrubbed the walls inside until the house felt warm and inviting again. But the most touching moment came when one of Margaret's old students, now a successful architect, arrived with a surprise. He had recreated a wooden bench from Margaret's old garden photos, the one she used to sit on with her late husband, Harold. It was placed in the center of the newly restored garden, surrounded by blooming flowers. When Margaret was discharged from the hospital 2 weeks later, she had no idea what awaited her. Michael had kept the renovations a secret, wanting it to be a surprise. As the taxi pulled up to her driveway, Margaret gasped. Her once negligent home now radiated life. A small crowd of neighbors and friends stood on her lawn, clapping and cheering as the car door opened. Margaret's hands trembled as she stepped out, tears streaming down her face. I don't understand," she whispered, overwhelmed. Michael stepped forward, smiling warmly. "Welcome home, Mrs. Bellamy. You've always been there for this community. Now it's our turn to be here for you." As Margaret toured her home, every room told a story of love and care. In her bedroom, someone had framed one of her old photos with Harold, placing it beside fresh flowers. In the living room, her favorite chair had been reupholstered and placed by the window, overlooking the garden. And in the backyard, the sight of her new bench, surrounded by flowers, made her break down in happy sobs. But the surprises didn't stop there. One by one, her former students began stepping forward, each sharing how Margaret had changed their lives. A woman in her 40s spoke through tears, When my parents were going through a divorce, Mrs. Bellamy spent hours after school tutoring me and listening to my worries. I wouldn't be where I am today without her." An older man added, "I was a troublemaker in school, but Mrs. Bellamy never gave up on me. She made me believe I could do better, and now I'm proud to say I'm a teacher because of her." Margaret listened, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. She had spent so many years feeling like the world had moved on without her, yet here was undeniable proof that her life had mattered deeply. In the weeks that followed, Margaret began to flourish. She started inviting neighbors over for tea, her laughter filling the air once again. Michael visited often, bringing small gifts like fresh flowers or baked goods. Margaret also found a new purpose. She began volunteering at the local community center, teaching gardening classes and hosting story time for children. Her wisdom and warmth became a beacon for everyone around her. For Michael, this journey was life-changing. He hadn't just saved Margaret's life, he'd helped bring an entire community together. One evening, as he sat on the bench in Margaret's garden, he found himself reflecting on the power of small actions. Sometimes, he thought, all it takes is one moment of noticing, one decision to care, to change everything. Margaret Bellamy's life was no longer defined by isolation and struggle. Instead, it became a story of triumph through love, community, and newfound purpose. Yet, as Margaret began to flourish, the full scope of her past challenges and the strength she'd summoned to overcome them came to light, deepening the bond she shared with those around her. One quiet afternoon, Michael Torres visited Margaret to check on her. The garden was in full bloom, a colorful testament to the care and effort of everyone in Maplewood. Margaret sat on her new bench, sipping tea, and gestured for Michael to join her. "Do you know why I stopped tending to my garden?" Margaret asked, her voice soft but steady. Michael shook his head, sensing that this was a story she'd been carrying for a long time. Margaret took a deep breath. "2 years ago, I fell in my kitchen. It wasn't serious at first, just a small sprain. But it scared me. I realized how fragile I'd become. After Harold passed and my son moved away, I thought I could handle things on my own. But that fall was a reminder that I was alone, and instead of asking for help, I just gave up." Michael felt a lump in his throat as she continued. "Every morning, I'd see the garden through my window, but I couldn't bring myself to step outside. It was as if the flowers didn't need me anymore, just like the world didn't seem to need me." Her words hung in the air, heavy with years of unspoken pain. Michael placed a comforting hand on hers. "The world needs you more than ever, Mrs. Bellamy," he said earnestly. "You've touched so many lives. You're the heart of this community." As Margaret's story spread, people from her past began to reconnect. One morning, a young woman knocked on her door. Margaret opened it to find a familiar face, a former student named Lisa, who was now in her mid-20s. "Mrs. Bellamy?" Lisa said, her eyes brimming with emotion. "I'm sorry to show up unannounced, but I heard about what happened to you. I wanted to thank you. You probably don't remember me, but you once gave me a book when I was struggling in school. It was about a girl who found her strength in the darkest of times. That book saved me. It made me believe in myself." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She remembered Lisa, a shy girl with a difficult home life. "Of course I remember you," Margaret said, pulling Lisa into a hug. Lisa reached into her bag and handed Margaret a beautifully bound journal. "I am an author now," she said, her voice trembling. "I wouldn't be here without you. This is my first book, and I wanted you to have the very first copy." Margaret held the book close, her hands trembling. The dedication inside read, "To Mrs. Bellamy, who planted the seeds of hope in my heart." Inspired by the stories of those she had unknowingly impacted, Margaret began a new chapter. She partnered with the local community center to create a program called Garden of Hope. The initiative paired seniors with children and young adults, teaching them gardening while encouraging intergenerational connections. Margaret's home became the program's centerpiece, with her garden serving as a classroom. Every Saturday, children gathered to plant seeds, pull weeds, and hear Margaret's stories about the lessons she'd learned through gardening and life. One day, as she watched a group of children laughing while planting sunflowers, Margaret turned to Michael. "Do you see this?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. I thought I'd lost my purpose, but it was here all along. I just needed someone to remind me." Michael smiled. "Sometimes it just takes a little light to help things grow again," he said. As the Garden of Hope flourished, the community decided to hold a celebration in Margaret's honor. The event brought together people of all ages, many of whom shared heartfelt stories about how Margaret had changed their lives. One by one, they stood on a small stage in her garden, holding flowers as they spoke. "Mrs. Bellamy taught me how to read when no one else had the patience," said one man, now a local librarian. "She helped me believe in myself when I thought I wasn't good enough," said a young mother, holding her toddler. The final speaker was Michael, who stepped up with a bouquet of daisies in hand. "Mrs. Bellamy, you taught us what it means to care for one another," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "You've shown us that even the smallest acts of kindness can grow into something extraordinary. On behalf of this community, thank you for your strength, your wisdom, and your endless generosity." Margaret wiped away tears as the crowd erupted into applause. As the sun set on the celebration, Margaret stood in her garden, watching the glow of lanterns strung between the trees. She felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. "I never imagined life could feel this full again," she said to Michael, who stood beside her. "It's because of you," Michael replied. "You gave this community so much, and now they're giving it back to you." Margaret smiled, her heart brimming with gratitude. "It's more than I ever dreamed," she said softly. From that day forward, Margaret's home became a beacon of hope in Maplewood, a place where people came to learn, grow, and reconnect. And for Michael, the journey solidified his belief in the power of compassion and the ripple effect of one simple act of care. Margaret Bellamy's life had transformed in ways she never thought possible. What had begun as a near tragedy had become the foundation for a new chapter filled with purpose, connection, and love. But as Margaret continued to rebuild her life, she faced new challenges that tested her resolve and proved that her greatest strength was yet to come. Despite her newfound joy, Margaret still struggled with moments of doubt. Quiet nights in her home often brought back memories of Harold, her late husband, and the life they had once shared. The solitude was a reminder of what she had lost, and it was a struggle she rarely voiced to others. One evening, as Marguerite sat in her living room, Michael visited her with an unexpected gift: a small sapling. "I thought your garden could use one more addition," he said, placing the tiny tree in her hands. Margaret ran her fingers over the delicate leaves. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "But why a tree?" Michael smiled. Trees take time to grow, just like people. They remind us that even when we feel small or fragile, we can still grow into something strong and lasting, just like you. Margaret was deeply touched. Together they planted the tree in the center of her garden, a symbol of resilience and the enduring power of hope. One rainy afternoon, Margaret received a letter from her son David, whom she hadn't spoken to in years. He had moved away shortly after Harold's passing, overwhelmed by grief and unable to face the memories tied to his childhood home. The letter was brief but heartfelt, expressing regret for his absence and a desire to reconnect. Margaret's hands trembled as she read it. The wounds of their estrangement had run deep, but the possibility of reconciliation filled her with both hope and apprehension. She shared the letter with Michael, seeking his advice. "What if he doesn't mean it?" Margaret asked, her voice tinged with fear. "What if I've built myself up just to be let down again?" Michael knelt beside her. "You've taught this entire community about forgiveness and growth. Maybe it's time to give yourself the same chance. You'll never know unless you try." Encouraged by his words, Margaret wrote back, inviting David to visit her. A week later, David arrived. Margaret's heart raced as she opened the door to find her son standing there, looking older and wearier than she remembered. For a moment, they simply stood in silence, the years of distance and unspoken words hanging between them. Then David spoke, his voice cracking. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have been here for you." Margaret pulled him into a hug, tears streaming down her face. "You're here now, and that's all that matters." The reunion was both cathartic and healing. Over the following days, David learned about everything that had happened: the fire, the community's outpouring of love, and the garden of hope. He was amazed by his mother's resilience and inspired by her transformation. As Margaret and David reconnected, the Garden of Hope began its first harvest. Children proudly picked ripe vegetables, seniors exchanged gardening tips, and families gathered to enjoy the fruits of their labor. Margaret stood at the center of it all, her heart swelling with pride. David joined in, helping children pull carrots from the soil and sharing stories about his childhood. It was the first time in years that Margaret felt her family was whole again. During a small celebration that evening, one of the children presented Margaret with a jar of honey labeled Bellamy's Garden Blend. It had been made by a local beekeeper who had started keeping hives in her garden, a testament to the life and abundance her efforts had nurtured. Margaret's sapling, the one she and Michael had planted, had already begun to grow. She decided to dedicate it to the next generation, turning it into a living time capsule. Each child who visited the garden added a small token, a handwritten note, a drawing, or a seed packet, to a box buried at its base. The idea was to unearth it in 20 years, a reminder of the community's shared journey. Margaret often sat by the tree, watching the children laugh and play. "This tree is like us," she told Michael one day. "It started small, but with care, it will grow into something beautiful and lasting." As the colder months approached, Margaret faced a new obstacle. Her health began to decline. The effects of the smoke inhalation and her previous isolation had taken a toll, and she required more medical attention. But instead of retreating into fear, Margaret leaned on the community she had helped build. Neighbors took turns bringing her meals, helping with her garden, and keeping her company. Michael visited daily, often bringing flowers or books to lift her spirits. David stayed by her side, rekindling the bond they had nearly lost. Despite the challenges, Margaret remained a pillar of strength and inspiration. "I've been given a second chance at life," she told her doctor one day, "and I'm going to make the most of every moment I have left." As winter turned to spring, Margaret's health began to stabilize. The Garden of Hope continued to thrive, and her home became a gathering place for people of all ages. Her story was featured in the local paper, drawing attention to the power of community and compassion. One bright morning, Margaret stood by her sapling, now taller and stronger, and tied a ribbon around its trunk. It was her way of marking the growth, not just of the tree, but of herself and the community that had helped her rebuild her life. "Do you see this, Harold?" she whispered, gazing at the sky. "We've grown something beautiful." Margaret Bellamy had become the heart of Maplewood, her story a living testament to the power of resilience, love, and community. As her health stabilized, she remained a central figure in the Garden of Hope, inspiring everyone around her. Yet Margaret knew that her journey wasn't just about the life she had rebuilt. It was about leaving behind something lasting, a gift that would continue to grow long after she was gone. One crisp morning, Margaret sat in her garden, pen in hand, writing a letter that would become part of the time capsule buried beneath the saplings she and Michael had planted. The letter was a reflection of her journey, filled with words of gratitude, wisdom, and hope for the next generation. To whoever reads this in the years to come, I hope this tree has grown tall and strong, its branches offering shade and comfort to those who pass beneath it. It began as a small sapling, planted with love during one of the most challenging times of my life. Like this tree, I learned that even in our darkest moments, we can find ways to grow if we let others help us. Never be afraid to ask for help. Never doubt the power of kindness. And always remember that even the smallest seed of love can grow into something extraordinary. This garden is proof of that. With all my heart. Margaret Bellamy? She sealed the letter with a trembling hand and handed it to a young boy named Ethan, who eagerly added it to the time capsule. Margaret watched as the children carefully placed the box into the earth, their laughter filling the air. As Margaret's story spread beyond Maplewood, it caught the attention of a local journalist. The article they published about her resilience and the Garden of Hope quickly gained traction, drawing interest from nearby towns and even a few charitable organizations. One afternoon, Margaret received a call from a community foundation offering to expand her initiative. They proposed creating similar programs in neighboring areas, using her story and the Garden of Hope as a model. Margaret was overwhelmed but excited at the thought of her little garden inspiring so many. She invited Michael and David to join her in a meeting with the foundation. Michael, ever supportive, suggested she become an honorary ambassador for the project, sharing her wisdom and experiences with others. David, now deeply involved in her life, offered to help manage the logistics. "I never imagined any of this," Margaret said during the meeting, tears in her eyes. "But if my story can help others find hope, then I'll gladly share it." To celebrate the launch of the expanded initiative, the foundation organized a Festival of Hope in Maplewood. The event was held in Margaret's garden, which had become a vibrant symbol of community and renewal. Colorful banners lined the street, local musicians performed, and families came from miles around to join the celebration. Margaret, now a beloved figure beyond her small town, was invited to give a speech. As she stood before the crowd, leaning lightly on her cane, her voice carried the weight of a lifetime of wisdom. "When I was at my lowest, I thought my story was over," she began, her voice steady and warm. But then, someone noticed. Someone cared. And that small act of kindness changed everything. What you see around you today isn't just a garden. It's a reminder that none of us are truly alone, and that love, when shared, can grow beyond anything we could ever imagine. The crowd erupted in applause, and Margaret's heart swelled with gratitude. Amid the joy of the festival, Margaret found herself facing a personal breakthrough. A young woman approached her nervously, holding a photograph. Mrs. Bellamy," she said softly, "I think you might have known my grandmother. She always spoke about a kind teacher who helped her during a very hard time. When I heard your name, I thought it might be you." Margaret took the photo and gasped. It was of a young girl she had tutored decades ago, a quiet, shy student who had blossomed under her guidance. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she handed the photo back. "I remember her well," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "She was an extraordinary girl." The young woman smiled. "She always said you were the reason she believed in herself. She passed that belief down to me. Thank you for everything you did for her, and for all of us." For Margaret, this moment was profound. She realized that her legacy wasn't just in the garden or the initiative, it was in the lives she had touched, the people who carried her kindness forward in their own ways. As the festival drew to a close, Michael presented Margaret with a special gift, a handcrafted plaque to be placed in her garden. It read, "In honor of Margaret Bellamy, whose strength and kindness remind us that even the smallest act of love can grow into something extraordinary. This garden blooms because of you." Margaret traced the words with her fingers, her heart overflowing. "This is more than I ever dreamed," she said, her voice trembling. "You deserve it all," Michael replied, "and so much more." As the sun set on the festival, Margaret sat on her bench, surrounded by the people she loved. She looked at the garden, her garden, and felt an overwhelming sense of peace. "This isn't just my story," she said to Michael. "It's ours, and it will keep growing long after we're gone." Michael nodded. "That's the beauty of it. What we plant today will bloom for generations." And as the lanterns in the garden flickered softly in the night, Margaret knew that her legacy was secure. She had rebuilt her life with love, and that love would continue to grow, spreading far beyond Maplewood. As the days turned into weeks and the Festival of Hope became a cherished memory, Margaret Bellamy's garden continued to bloom, not just with flowers, but with the bonds she had sown in her community. The Garden of Hope became a hub for connection, healing, and inspiration, drawing visitors from all over. But Margaret, ever humble, saw it simply as a reflection of what people could achieve together. One quiet morning, Margaret received an unexpected package. Inside was a yellowed envelope with her name written in familiar handwriting. It was a letter from her late husband, Harold, written decades earlier, but somehow lost in the shovel of life. The letter had been discovered during renovations at the local post office and redirected to her home. Margaret's hands trembled as she opened it, her heart pounding with anticipation. "My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer by your side. But I want you to know that you were, and always will be, the best part of my life. Your kindness, your strength, and your unwavering love made every day brighter. I hope you never forget how extraordinary you are, and I pray that even when I'm gone, you'll continue to share that light with the world. You've always had a way of bringing people together, Margaret. Don't let that gift fade. Keep growing, keep loving, and remember, I'm with you in every step you take. Forever yours, Harold." Margaret clutched the letter to her chest, tears streaming down her face. Harold's words felt like a bridge between the life she had shared with him and the one she had rebuilt on her own. His faith in her had never wavered, even from beyond the grave. As winter approached, Margaret faced another challenge. Her health, though stable, began to decline once more. This time, she accepted it with grace, knowing she had lived fully and with purpose. Michael, ever loyal, visited daily to sit with her, bringing fresh flowers from the garden. David, now deeply reconnected with his mother, moved into her home to care for her. They spent evenings reminiscing about her life, her students, and the garden that had brought so much joy. One evening, as the first snow began to fall, Margaret called Michael and David to her bedside. "I want you both to promise me something," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Promise me you'll keep the garden alive. It's not just a place for plants. It's a place for people to find hope, to grow, and to connect. That's all I want." Michael and David exchanged a glance, both swallowing back emotion. "We promise," they said in unison. Margaret smiled. "Good, then I can rest easy." When Margaret passed away a few weeks later, the entire community felt the loss deeply. The news spread quickly and people began gathering at her garden to pay their respects. The sapling she and Michael had planted stood tall, its leaves dusted with snow, a silent witness to the love and unity Margaret had fostered. On the day of her memorial, hundreds of people filled the garden, each carrying a flower. Former students spoke of how Margaret had changed their lives. Neighbors shared stories of her kindness, and children placed their flowers at the base of the sapling, which had become a symbol of her enduring spirit. Michael stepped forward to deliver the eulogy. His voice trembled, but was filled with conviction. Margaret taught us that even the smallest act of kindness can grow into something extraordinary. She showed us that no one is ever truly alone if we care for one another. Today, we honor her not by mourning her loss, but by continuing her legacy. Let this garden remind us all to grow with love, just as she did. In the months following Margaret's passing, the Garden of Hope became even more vibrant. Michael and David worked tirelessly to honor her wishes, expanding the program to include classes on resilience and community building. They added a small plaque beneath the sapling that read, "In memory of Margaret Bellamy, a woman who grew hope, love, and unity. Her legacy lives on in every flower, every friendship, and every act of kindness." Children continued to gather every Saturday, planting seeds and listening to stories. Seniors found solace in tending to the garden's blooms. Families bonded over the simple joy of working the soil together. Margaret's vision had not only endured, it had flourished. One sunny afternoon, a young boy approached Michael in the garden. "Mr. Torres," he asked, holding up a small pot with a sprouting seedling, "do you think Mrs. Bellamy can see the garden from heaven?" Michael knelt down, his heart swelling with emotion. "I think she can," he said, smiling, "and I think she's very proud of all of us." The boy nodded solemnly before placing his pot in the soil, patting it down carefully. "Then I'll make sure my plant grows really big so she can see it." The simple act reminded Michael of what Margaret had taught him, that kindness, no matter how small, always has the power to grow into something extraordinary. Years later, the Garden of Hope stood as a beacon of community and compassion, drawing visitors from near and far. Margaret's sapling had grown into a towering tree, its branches providing shade for those who came to reflect, laugh, and connect. The time capsule buried beneath it remained untouched, a treasure for a future generation to uncover. Michael, now older, often visited the garden, sitting beneath the tree to watch the life it fostered. Every now and then, he would look up at its branches and feel Margaret's presence, her spirit woven into the very fabric of the community she had nurtured. And so Margaret Bellamy's story continued, not in words or deeds alone, but in the lives she had touched, and the garden that would forever bloom in her honor. Margaret Bellamy's passing had left an irreplaceable void in the hearts of the Maplewood community, but her legacy continued to inspire those who had been touched by her kindness and resilience. The Garden of Hope thrived, becoming not just a local treasure, but a symbol of what love and unity could accomplish. As time passed, the garden's influence began to ripple far beyond Maplewood, carrying Margaret's story to new places and generations. 10 years after Margaret's passing, on a sunny spring morning, the community gathered once again at the Garden of Hope for a special occasion: the opening of the time capsule, buried beneath Margaret's beloved sapling. The tree, now towering and majestic, stood as a testament to the growth and strength Margaret had believed in. Children who had once played in the garden were now young adults, standing with their own children. Michael Torres, older but still brimming with the same warmth and compassion Margaret had inspired in him, held a small spade as he dug carefully around the base of the tree. The crowd grew silent as the box was unearthed. Michael lifted it gently and placed it on a table. With hands trembling from both age and emotion, he opened the lid, revealing the treasures placed there years ago. Inside were handwritten notes, drawings, and small keepsakes from the children who had once gathered in the garden. Among them was Margaret's letter, carefully preserved. Michael unfolded it and began to read aloud, his voice steady yet tinged with emotion. To the future keepers of this garden, if you are reading this, it means the seeds we planted together have grown into something beautiful. This garden is more than soil and flowers. It is a place where love, hope, and connection take root. I hope you continue to nurture it, not just with your hands, but with your hearts. Remember, it only takes one small act of kindness to change the world. With all my love, Margaret Bellamy. As Michael finished, there wasn't a dry eye among the crowd. Margaret's words, though written long ago, felt as if they were spoken directly to each person there. Inspired by the time capsule's opening, the community decided to expand the Garden of Hope once again. They dedicated a new section of the garden to teaching sustainability and conservation, ensuring that Margaret's values of care and stewardship would be passed down to future generations. David, Margaret's son, took the lead in this effort. Now a steadfast member of the community, he often reflected on how reconnecting with his mother had transformed his life. "She taught me that it's never too late to start over," he said during the garden's reopening ceremony. This garden is proof of that. Local schools began organizing field trips to the garden, where children learned not only about plants, but also about kindness and community. Teachers often shared Margaret's story, using her life as an example of perseverance and the power of human connection. Though Michael had never sought recognition, his role in Margaret's story became widely known. People often approached him in the garden, thanking him for the call he had made that changed everything. But Michael always redirected the praise. "It wasn't just me," he would say. "Margaret had the strength and love to inspire all of this. I was just lucky to be part of her journey." One evening, as Michael sat under Margaret's tree, he noticed a young girl planting flowers nearby. She struggled with the spade, her tiny hands barely able to grasp it. Michael walked over and knelt beside her. "Need some help?" he asked with a gentle smile. The girl nodded, her face lighting up. Together, they worked to plant a row of daisies, and as they finished, the girl looked up at him. "Who planted this big tree?" she asked, pointing to the sapling that had grown into a towering oak. Michael's eyes softened. A very special lady named Margaret. She believed in planting things that could grow into something beautiful. The girl tilted her head. Will my flowers grow big like her tree? They might not grow as tall, Michael said, but they'll bring just as much joy. Over the years, the Garden of Hope became a model for other communities. Inspired by Margaret's story, towns across the country began creating their own gardens, each one tailored to the unique needs of its people. Some focused on providing fresh produce to food deserts, while others became spaces for therapy and healing. At the heart of each new garden was Margaret's philosophy that even the smallest acts of care could grow into something extraordinary. Her story was shared in classrooms, community centers, and even a documentary that highlighted how one woman's resilience had sparked a nationwide movement. As the years passed, a new generation took over the care of the Garden of Hope. Ethan, the boy who had once asked if Margaret could see the garden from heaven, was now a young man. He often led tours of the garden, sharing Margaret's story with visitors. One day, as he stood beneath the great oak tree, he placed his hand on its trunk and spoke to a group of children. This tree started as a tiny sapling planted during a time when one woman needed hope. It grew because people cared, and now it's here to remind us that no matter how small we feel, we can all grow into something strong and beautiful. One final addition was made to the garden, a statue of Margaret Bellamy sitting on her beloved bench, a soft smile on her face, surrounded by blooming flowers. Beneath it, an inscription read, "Margaret Bellamy, a gardener of hope, a nurturer of love, and a reminder that even the smallest seed can change the world." As the sun set over the garden that evening, the golden light cast a warm glow over the statue. Visitors lingered, some leaving flowers, others sitting quietly in reflection. And in the gentle rustle of the oak tree's leaves, it felt as if Margaret's spirit was still there, watching over the garden that had become her lasting legacy. A place where love, hope, and kindness would continue to bloom for generations to come. As the years passed, the Garden of Hope continued to bloom, growing into something far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Margaret Bellamy's legacy became a living testament to the power of compassion, the resilience of the human spirit, and the beauty of a community united by kindness. Each visitor, each new seed planted, carried a piece of her vision into the future. But the true gift of Margaret's life wasn't just the garden, it was the lessons she left behind. One evening, Michael Torres sat under Margaret's oak tree, now a towering canopy of green. It had become his favorite spot to reflect, especially as the garden's caretakers prepared for another expansion. The evening air was warm, the scent of lavender drifting through the garden, and the laughter of children filled the space. A young woman approached holding a journal. "Mr. Torres," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I found this in my grandmother's attic. It belonged to Margaret. I thought you should have it." Michael opened the journal carefully, recognizing Margaret's elegant handwriting. Inside were pages of thoughts, stories, and wisdom she had penned over the years. Each entry revealed a piece of her soul, her struggles, her triumphs, and her unwavering belief in the goodness of people. One passage stood out to Michael, bringing tears to his eyes. "We are all gardeners in life. Some plant seeds of kindness, others nurture dreams, and many pull the weeds of doubt from others' hearts. But no matter our role, we are all part of the same garden. Together we create beauty that endures far beyond our time." Michael closed the journal, clutching it tightly. He knew what he had to do. The following weekend, Michael and David held a special event in the garden to share Margaret's journal with the community. People gathered under the oak tree, sitting on picnic blankets and benches, as Michael read aloud from the pages. Each passage was met with nods, tears, and applause as Margaret's words resonated deeply with everyone present. "Margaret didn't just grow a garden," Michael said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "She grew hope in all of us, and her words remind us that we each have the power to carry that hope forward." The event inspired the creation of a new program, Margaret's Journal of Hope, a community initiative encouraging people to share their own stories of resilience and kindness. Each story was added to the garden's archive, creating a living history of the impact Margaret had made. Over time, the Garden of Hope became a symbol recognized far beyond Maplewood. It was featured in documentaries, books, and even a global campaign promoting community-driven change. Margaret's story inspired gardens to spring up in cities and towns worldwide, each one a testament to her belief that small acts of kindness could create extraordinary transformations. One such garden was planted in a war-torn village, bringing children together to plant flowers as a symbol of peace. Another grew in a bustling city, providing a safe space for people struggling with loneliness. In each garden, Margaret's story was shared, reminding people that even in the face of adversity, hope could take root. As Michael grew older, he continued to dedicate himself to the Garden of Hope. But as his health began to decline, he decided it was time to pass the torch to a new generation. At a small gathering, he handed the journal to Ethan, now a young man who had grown up in the garden. "Take care of this place," Michael said, his voice filled with pride. "And remember, it's not just a garden, it's a promise to always care for one another." Ethan nodded, tears in his eyes. I won't let you down." Years later, a group of children gathered under the oak tree, listening as Ethan told them Margaret's story. One child raised their hand and asked, "Do you think she knew how many people she helped?" Ethan smiled, looking up at the tree's expansive branches. "I think she did. But what mattered most to her wasn't how many people she helped. It was that the kindness kept growing. And that's something we can all do." The children nodded, inspired by the story. One by one, they began planting new seeds in the garden, continuing the cycle of growth and hope that Margaret had started so many years ago. Margaret's story is a reminder that no act of kindness is too small. In a world that often feels disconnected, we all have the power to make a difference, whether by helping a neighbor, planting a seed, or simply showing someone that they're not alone. Her life teaches us that even in the face of adversity, love and compassion can create something extraordinary. Before you leave, we invite you to reflect on Margaret's story. How can you plant seeds of kindness in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales like this. And remember to turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Together, we can keep Margaret's legacy alive by spreading hope, one story at a time. Let's make the world a little brighter, one act of kindness at a time.